Hello, my name is Juan and today I'll be presenting my PowerPoint presentation of the Berlin Wall. I'm from the Group 10-3 and I'm part of the ESL class with Mr. Juan. And I'm a student from the Bilingual Specialized Bilingual School. Now, let's get started. Okay, now the Berlin Wall. On August 13, 1961, the communist government of the German Democratic Republic, GDR, or East Germany, began to build a barbed wire and concrete anti-physical such wall or anti-physical bulwark between East and West Berlin. The official purpose of this Berlin Wall was to keep so-called fascists from entering East Germany and undermining the socialist state, but it primarily served the objective of stemming mass defections from East to West. The Berlin Wall stood until November 9, 1989, when the head of the East German Communist Party announced that citizens of the GDR crossed the border whenever they pleased. That night, ecstatic crowds swarmed the wall. Excuse me. Some crossed freely into West Berlin, while others brought hammers and picks began to chip away at the wall itself. To this day, the Berlin Wall remains one of the most powerful and enduring symbols of the war. As World War II came to an end in 1945, a pair of elite peace conference at the Yalta Potsdam determined Germany's territories. They split the defeated nation into four Allied occupation zones. The eastern part of the country went to the Soviet Union, while the western part went to the United States, Great Britain, and eventually France. On October 22, 1969, a quarrel between an East German border guard and an American official on his way to the opera in East Berlin very nearly led to one of the observers called a nuclear age equivalent of the Wild West showdown and the OKO and the OK quarrel. That day, American and Soviet tanks faced off at the checkpoint Charlie for 16 hours. Photographs of the confrontation are some of the most familiar and memorable images of the Cold War. Even though Berlin was located entirely within the Soviet part of the country, it sat about 100 miles from the border between the eastern and western occupation zones. The Yalta and Potsdam agreements split the city into similar sectors. The Soviets took the eastern half, while the other allies took the western. This four-way occupation of Berlin began in June 1945. The existence of the West Berlin, a constant capitalist city that between the communist East Germany, stuck like a bone in the Soviet throat. As leader Nick Savuchi put it, the Russians began maneuvering to drive the United States, Britain, and France out of the city for good. In 1948, a Soviet blockade of West Berlin aimed to stop the Western allies of the city instead of retreating. However, the United States and allies occupied their sectors of the city from the air. This effort, known as the Berlin Airlift, lasted for more than a year and delivered more than 2.3 million tons of food, fuel, and goods to West Berlin. The Soviets call of the blockade in 1949. After a decade of a relative calm, tensions flared again in 1958. For the next 3 years, the Soviet emboldened by the successful launch of the Sputnik satellite the year before during the space race and embarrassed by the seemingly endless flow of refugees from east to west, nearly 3 million since the end of the blockade, many of them young skilled workers such as doctors, teachers, and engineers, blustered and made threats while the Allies resisted summits, summits and conferences negotiations came and went without resolution. Meanwhile, the flood of refugees continued. In June 1961, some 19,000 people left the GDR through Berlin. The following month, 30,000 fled. In the first 11 days of August. 16,000 East Germans crossed the border into West Berlin, and on August 12, some 2,400 followed, the largest number of defectors ever to leave East Germany in a single day. That night, Premier Kosich gave the East German government permission to stop the flow of the immigrants by closing its border for good. In just 2 weeks, the East German Army police force and volunteer construction workers had completed a makeshift barbed wire on concrete Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall that divided one city of the city from another. Before the wall was built, Berliners on both sides of the city could move around fairly freely. They crossed the east-west border to work, to shop, to go to the theater and the movies. Trains and subway lines carried passengers back and forth, back and forth after the wall was built. It became possible to get from East to West Berlin, except through one or three checkpoints at Helmstedt, Checkpoint Alpha, an American military powerless at Drenlinden, Checkpoint Bravo, and in the center of Berlin at Francis Checkpoint Charlie. Eventually, the GDR built 12 checkpoints around the wall. At each of the checkpoints, East German soldiers screened diplomats and other officials before they were allowed to enter or leave, except under special circumstances, travelers from East and West Berlin were freely across around the border. Now, the construction of the Berlin Wall did stop the flood of refugees from east to west, and it did refuse the crisis over Berlin. Though he was not happy about it, President John F. Kennedy conceded that a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war. Almost 2 years after Berlin Wall erected, John F. Kennedy delivered one of the most famous addresses of his presidency to a crowd of more than 120,000 gathered outside of West Berlin City Hall. Just steps from the Gadenberg Gate, Kennedy's speech has been largely remembered for one particular phrase, I am a Berliner. In all, at least 171 people were killed trying to get over, under, or around the Berlin Wall. Escape from East Germany was not impossible. However, 1961 until the wall came down in 1989, more than 5,000 East Germans, including some 600 border guards, managed to cross the border by jumping out the windows adjacent to the wall, climbing over the barbed wire, flying in hot air balloons, crawling through the sewers, and driving through unfortified parts of the wall at high speeds. Excuse me. On November 9, 1989, as the Cold War began to draw across Eastern Europe, the spokesman for East Berlin's Communist Party announced a change in the city's relations with the West starting at midnight that day. He said citizens of the GDR were free to cross the country's borders. East and West Berliners flocked to the wall, drinking and beer, champagne, and chanting, tore off, opened the gate. At midnight, they folded through the checkpoints. More than 2 million people from East Berlin visited West Berlin that weekend to participate in a celebration that was, one journalist wrote, the greatest street party in the history of the world. People used hammers and picks to knock down chunks of walls. They even known as Machu Picchu or wall woodpeckers, while cranes and bulldozers pulled down sections after section. Soon, the wall was gone and Berlin was united for the first time since 1945. Only one day, one burner spray painted on a piece of the wall. A piece of the wall is the war over. The reunification of East and West Germany was made official on October 3, 1990, almost 1 year after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, I didn't cover this earlier, but here we can see the construction of the Berlin Wall. Now, since there's probably a lot more to cover up, I'm going to cover the World War II. Now, the World War II, incentively created in Europe by the First World War in 1914 to 1918, set the stage for another international conflict, World War II, which broke out 2 decades later and will prove even more devastating, rising to power in an economically and politically unstable Germany. Adolf Hitler of the Nazi Party rammed the nation and signed strategic treaties with Italy and Japan to further his ambitions of world domination. Hitler's invasion of Poland in September 1939 drove Great Britain and France to declare war on Germany, making the beginning of the World War II. Over the next 6 years, the conflict would take more lives and destroy more land and property around the globe than any previous war. Among the estimated 45 to 60 million people killed were 6 million Jews murdered in Nazi concentration camps as part of Hitler's diabolical final solution, known as the Holocaust. The devastation of the war, as World War I was known at the time, had greatly destabilized Europe, and in many respects, World War II grew out of issues left unresolved by the earlier conflict, in particular, political and economic instability in Germany and lingering resentment over the harsh terms imposed by the Versailles Treaty fueled the rise to power of Adolf Hitler and National Socialist German Workers' Party, abbreviated as NSDAP in German and the Nazi Party in English. As early as 1923, in his memoir of propaganda track, Menf, Adolf Hitler had predicted a general European war that will result in the extermination of the Jewish race in Germany. Nice fact, isn't it? After becoming Chancellor of Germany in 1933, Hitler swiftly consolidated power, anointing himself forever supreme leader. In 1934, obsessed with the idea of the superiority of the pure German race, which he called Arden, Hitler believed that war was the only way to gain the necessarily living space for the German race to expand. In the mid-1930s, he secretly began the rearmament of Germany and violation of the Versailles Treaty after signing allegiance with Italy and Japan against the Soviet Union. Hitler sent troops to occupy Australia in 1938, and the following year annexed Silesia. Hitler's open aggression went unchecked. Sorry, I couldn't say that correctly. I don't remember how to just say it correctly. Excuse me. As the United States and Soviet Union were concentrating on internal politics at the time, and neither France nor Britain, the two other nations most devastated by the Great War, were eager for a confrontation. Now, in late August 1939, Hitler and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin signed the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which incited a frenzy of fury in London and Paris. Hitler had a long-planned an invasion of Poland, a nation to which Great Britain and France had guaranteed military support if it were attacked by Germany. The pact with Stalin meant that Hitler would not face a war on two fronts once he invaded Poland, and will have Soviet assistance in conquering and dividing the nation itself. Now, on September 1, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland from the west. 2 days later, France and Britain declared war on Germany, beginning World War II. Now, this gets the good part. On September 17, Soviet troops invaded Poland from the east under attack from both sides. Poland fell quickly, and by early 1940, Germany and the Soviet Union had divided control over the nation, according to a secret protocol appended to the Non-Aggression Pact. Stalin's forces then moved to occupy the Baltic states like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and defeated a resisting Finland in the Russo-Finnish War. During the 6 months following the invasion of Poland, the lack of action on the part of Germany and the Allies in the West led talk in the news media of a phony war. At sea, however, the British and German natives faced off in heated battle, and lethal German U-boats, submarines struck at merchant shipping bound for Britain, sinking more than 100 vessels in the first 4 months of the World War II. On April 9, 1940, Germany simultaneously invaded Norway and occupied Denmark, and the war began in the Near East. On May 10, German forces swept through Belgium and the Netherlands in what became known as Blitzkrieg, or in other words, the Blinding War. 3 days later, Hitler troops crossed the Mayhew River and struck French forces at Sedan, located at the northern end of the Maginot Line, an elaborate chain of fortifications constructed after World War I and considered an impenetrable defensive barrier. In fact, the Germans broke through the line with their tanks and planes and continued to the rear, rendering it useless. The British Special Force, or in other words, classified as BEF, was evacuated by sea from Dunkirk in late May, while in the south, French forces mounted a doomed resistance, which France, on the verge of collapse, Italy's fastest dictator, Benito Mussolini, formed an alliance with Hitler, the Pact of Steel, and Italy declared war against France and Britain on June 10. Now, on June 14, the German forces entered Paris, a new government formed by Marshal Philippe Pétain, France's hero of World War I, requested an emergency 2 nights later. France was subsequently divided into 2 zones, one under German military occupation and the other Pétain's government installed at Vichy, France. Hitler now turning his attention to Britain, which had the defensive advantage of being separated from the continent by the English Channel. To pave the way of an amphibious invasion, Dub Operation Sinai, in other words, German planes bombed Britain extensively beginning in September 1940 until May 1949, known as the Blitz, including night raids on London and other industrial centers that caused heavy civilian casualties and damage. The Royal Air Force, known as RAF, eventually defeated the Luftwaffe German air forces in the Battle of Britain, and Hitler postponed his plans to invade, which Britain's defensive resources pushed to the limit. Prime Minister Winston Churchill began receiving crucial aid from the US under the Lend-Lease Act, passed by the Congress in early 1949. Now, while Britain facing Germany in Europe, the United States was the only nation capable of combating Japanese aggression. By the late 1941, including an expansion of its ongoing war with China and the seizure of European colonial holdings in the Far East on December 7, 1941, 360 Japanese aircraft attacked the major U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, taking the Americans completely by surprise and claiming the lives of more than 2,300 troops that attacked on Pearl Harbor, served to unify American public opinion in favor of entering World War II. And on December 8, Congress declared war on Japan with only one dissenting vote. Germany and the other Axis power promptly declared war on the United States. After a long string of Japanese victories, the U.S. Pacific Fleet won the Battle of Midway in June 1942, which proved to be a turning point in the war on Guadalcanal and Guadalcanal, excuse me for the pronunciation, one of the Southern Solomon Islands. The Allies also had success against Japanese forces in the series of battles from August 1942 to February 1943. Helping turn the tide further in the Pacific in mid-1943, Allied naval forces began an aggressive counterattack against Japan, involving a series of amphibious assaults on key Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. Excuse me. This island hopping strategy proved successful, and Allied forces moved closer to the ultimate goal of invading the mainland Japan. In North Africa, British and American forces had defeated the Italians and Germans by 1943. An Allied invasion of Sicily and Italy followed. Then Mussolini's government fell in July 1943, though Allied against fighting the Germans in Italy would continue until 1945. On the Eastern Front, a Soviet counter-offensive launched in November 1942 ended the bloody Battle of Stalingrad, which has seen some of the fiercest combat of World War II. The approach of winter, along with dwindling food and medical supplies, spelled the end of German troops there, and the last of them surrendered on January 31, 1943. On June 6, 1944, declared as D-Day, the Allies began a massive invasion of Europe, landing 156,000 British, Canadians, and African soldiers on the beach of Normandy, France. In response, Hitler poured all the remaining strength of his army into Western Europe, ensuring Germany's defeat in the east. Soviet troops soon advanced into Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania, while Hitler gathered his force to drive the Americans and British back from Germany in the Battle of the Bulge. On December 1944 to January 1945, the last major German offensive of the war. An intensive aerial bombardment in February 1945 preceded the Allied land invasion of Germany, and by the time Germany formally surrendered on May 8th, Soviet forces have occupied much of the country. Hitler was already dead, having died by suicide on April 30 in his Berlin bunker. Now, at the end of the Potsdam Conference of July-August 1945, U.S. President Harry S. Truman, Churchill, and Stalin discussed the ongoing war with Japan as well as the peace settlement with Germany. Post-war Germany will be divided into 4 occupation zones to be controlled by the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States, and France on the decisive matter of the Eastern Europe's future. Churchill and Truman acquiesced to Stalin, as they needed Soviet cooperation in the war against Germany. Heavy casualties campaigns at Iwo Jima, February 1945, and in Okinawa, April-June 1945, and fears of the even closer land invasion of Japan led Truman to authorize the use of a new devastating weapon developing during a top-secret operation code named the Manhattan Project. The atomic bomb was unleashed on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagashi in early August. On August 15, the Japanese government issued a statement declaring they would accept the terms of a postman declaration. On September 2, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur accepted Japan's formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Now, World War was explored as a glaring paradox between the United States forces, although more than 1 million Americans served in the war to defeat Nazis and fix them. They did so segregated units, the same discriminating Jim Crow policies that were rampant in American society were reinforced by the U.S. military. Black servicemen rarely saw combat and were largely relegated to labor and supply units that were commanded by white officers. There were several African American units that proved essential in helping to win World War II, with the Sussex Airmen being among the most celebrated, but the Red Ball Express, the truck convoy, and mostly black drivers were responsible for delivering essential goods to the General George S. Patton's troops on the front lines in France. The all-black six 761st Street Tank Battalion fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and the 19 and the excuse me, and the 92 Infantry Division fought in fierce ground battles in Italy. Yet, despite their role in defeating fascism, the fight for equality continued for African American soldiers after World War II ended. They remained in segregated units and lower ranking positions well into the Korean War, a few years after President Truman signed an executive order to desecrate the U.S. military, army, and legacy. Now, in other words, World War II proved to be the deadliest international conflict in history, taking the lives of 60 to 80 million people, including 6 million Jews who died at the hands of the Nazis during the Holocaust. Civilians made up an estimated 50 to 55 million deaths from the war, while military comprised by 21 to 25 million of those lost during the war. Millions more were injured and still more lost homes and property. The legacy of the war would include the spread of communism from the Soviet Union into Eastern Europe, as well as its eventual triumph in China and the global shift in power from Europe to two rival superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, that will soon face off against each other in the Cold War. Now, that's all for the World War II. Now let's get to the Cold War, excuse me. Now, let's get started. The Cold War, the open yet restricted rivalry that developed after World War II between the United States and the Soviet Union and the respective allies. The Cold War was waged on political, economic, and propaganda fronts and had only limited resources to weapons. The term was first used by the English writer George Orwell in an article published in 1945 to refer to what he predicted would be a nuclear stalemate between two or three monstrous superstates, each possessed of a weapon by which millions of people can be wiped out in a few seconds. And it was first used in the United States by American financier and presidential advisor Vernon Grouch in a speech at the State House in Columbia, South Carolina in 1947. Following the surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945, near the close of the World War II, the uneasy wartime alliance between the United States and Great Britain on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other began to unravel. By 1948, the Soviets had installed left-wing governments in the countries of Eastern Europe that had been liberated by the Red Army. The Americans and the British feared the permanent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and the threat of the Soviet-influenced Communist Party coming to power in the democracies of Eastern Europe. The Soviets, and on the other hand, were determined to maintain control of Eastern Europe in order to safeguard against any possible renewed threat from Germany, and then were intent on spreading communism worldwide, largely for ideological reasons. The Cold War has solidified by 1947 to 1948, when the US aid provided under the Marshall Plan to Western Europe had brought those countries under American influence, and the Soviets had installed openly communist regimes in Eastern Europe. The Cold War reached its peak in 1948 to 1953. In the period of the Soviets unsuccessfully blockading the western-held sectors of West Berlin through 1948 to 1949, the United States and their European allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and an unified military command to resist Soviet presence in Europe. 1949, the Soviets exploded their first atomic warhead. 1949, thus ending the American monopoly on the atomic bomb. The Chinese communists came to power in mainland China. 1949, and the Soviet-supported Communist government of North Korea invaded US-supported South Korea in 1950, setting off an indecisive Korean War that lasted until 1953. Excuse me. From 1953 to 1957, Cold War tensions relaxed somewhat, largely owing to the deaths of the longtime Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. In 1953, nevertheless, the standoff remained. An unified military organization among the Soviet bloc countries, the Warsaw Pact, was formed in 1955, and West Germany was admitted into NATO that same year. Another intense stage of the Cold War was in 1958 to 1962. The United States and the Soviet Union began developing intercontinental ballistic missiles. And in 1962, the Soviets began secretly installing missiles in Cuba that could be launched to nuclear attacks on the US cities. This sparked the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, a confrontation that brought the two superpowers to brink of war before an agreement was reached to withdraw the missiles. The Cuban Missiles Crisis showed that neither the United States nor the Soviet Union were ready to use nuclear weapons for fear of the other's retaliation and thus of mutual atomic annihilation. The two superpowers soon signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which banned above-ground nuclear weapons testing, but the crisis also hardened the Soviets' determination neither again to be humiliated by their military inferiority, and they began a build-up of both conventional and strategic forces that the United States was forced to match for the next 25 years. Through the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union avoided direct military confrontation in Europe and engaged in actual combat operation only to keep allies from defecting to the other side or to overthrow them after they had gone so. The Soviet Union sent troops to preserve communist rule in East Germany in 1953, Hungary to 1966. Czechoslovakia, excuse me for the pronunciation, 1968, and Afghanistan, 1979. For its part, the United States helped overthrow a left-wing government in Guatemala in 1954, supported an unsuccessful invasion of Cuba in 1961, invaded the Dominican Republic in 1965, and Grenada in 1983. and under, excuse me, and undertook on long 1964 to 1975 an unsuccessful effort to prevent communist North Vietnam from bringing South Vietnam under its rule. In the course of the 1960s and the 70s, however, the bipolar struggle between the Soviet and American blocs gave away a more completed pattern of international relationships in which the war was no longer split into clearly opposite blocs. A major split have occurred between the Soviet Union and China in 1960 and widened over the years, shattering the unity of the communist bloc. In the meantime, Western Europe and Japan achieved dynamic economic growth in the 1950s and 1960s, reducing their relative inferiority to the United States. Less powerful countries had more room to assert their independence and often showed themselves resistant to superpower corsage or cajoling. The 1970s saw an easing of Cold War tensions as embedded in the strategically armed limitation tanks, and also known as SALT, that led to the SALT I and II agreements of the 1972 and 1979, respectively, in which the two superpowers set limits on their ballistic missiles and on their strategic missiles capable of carrying nuclear weapons. That was followed by a period of renewed Cold War tensions in the early 1980s as the two superpowers continued their massive arms buildup and competed for influence in the Third War. But the Cold War began to break down in the late 1980s during the administration of Soviet leader Mikhail S. Gorbachev. He dismantled the totalitarian aspects of the Soviet system and began efforts to democratize the Soviet political system. When communist regiments in the Soviet bloc countries of Eastern Europe collapsed in 1989 to 1990, Gorbachev acquiesces in their fail. The rise of power of democratic governments in East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and subsistence was quickly followed by the unification of the West and West Germany under NATO auspices, again with Soviet approval. Golf's internal reforms have meanwhile weakened its own Communist Party and allowed power to shift to Russia and the other constituent republics up to the United Soviet Union. In late 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and 15 newly independent nations were born from its course, including a Russia with democratically elected anti-communism leader. The Cold War came to finally end. Now, here we have the bibliography. Now, that will be all. I hope you all enjoyed the presentation, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Have a great weekend.